Mr. Commissioner, it's Mark East for Government of Canada. I talked to Ms. Baker while making a quick clarification question based on the last answer given by Dr. Carey. Dr. Carey, in your last answer, you talked about, in particular, some work that was done by a DFO scientist by the name of Dr. Wayne Fairchild. And I believe we've heard some evidence in these hearings about the work that Dr. Fairchild has done with respect to, I believe it's nanophenols and spruce budworm pesticides in New Brunswick and their impacts on Atlantic salmon. In your answer, I understand that you referred to work that Dr. Fairchild did with respect to Pacific salmon. I just want to know if you meant to say Atlantic salmon in your answer.
I absolutely meant to say Atlantic salmon. I apologize for that if I said Pacific.
Mr. Hopkins-Utter is next. He's got 5 minutes of questions.
Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Shane Hopkins-Utter, first initial S for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I initially estimated 10 minutes. I will do my best to keep it in 5. Dr. Carey, you had this morning spoken briefly about lobsters and invertebrates and the effects of endocrine disruptors. Is that correct?
I mentioned it, yes.
Yesterday I spoke to Dr. McDonald about some of the evidence that we have in the Commission Policy and Practice Report telling us that endocrine disruptors can, for example, suppress salmon immune system, affect migration, olfactory systems, and maturation rates. I want to take you to Commission tab number 25. This is Exhibit 983, Integrated Water Quality Monitoring Plan for the Shuswap Lakes, BC. At page 8 of this document on the PDF, it reads, and I'm going to quote here, very top, the degree to which emerging contaminants, e.g. personal care products, flame retardants, pharmaceuticals are present in Shuswap Lake, Mara Lake, and major tributaries is unknown due to limited monitoring budgets and the traditional scope of regional water quality monitoring programs. It goes on to say a little further below, although the concentrations are likely quite low and the ecological implications uncertain at that time. But it says right here, it is likely that some emerging contaminants are already present in Shuswap Lake, Mara Lakes, and some tributaries. Is that correct, that those emerging contaminants are likely present?
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with this report. I haven't read it, and I'm not familiar with Shuswap Lake, so my response must be very general. Flame retardants, brominated flame retardants, fluorinated surfactants, contaminants of that type we believe are atmospherically transported and are likely to be deposited in most aquatic systems in the northern hemisphere. So for those contaminants, I would say yes, they are likely to be present in Shuswap Lake. I know of no reason why they wouldn't be. For personal care products and pharmaceuticals of the type we've been worried about now, they are over-the-counter materials that we believe are entering aquatic systems through municipal wastewater systems. And I'm not aware of if there are municipal wastewater systems on that lake, and therefore I couldn't comment. If there are municipal wastewater systems on that lake, then we would probably be able to detect them in the municipal wastewater effluents, possibly not in the lake itself, depending on dilution.
Now, one of the issues with personal care products, as I understand it, is that many of them have antimicrobial properties which contain the chemical, am I pronouncing it right, triclosan? Those are, a major concern about that is that they are in fact endocrine disruptors. Is that not true?
I'm not aware of that. I believe the major concern with triclosan is that it, as an antimicrobial, could impact the operation of municipal wastewater treatment plants, which are microbial based, but I am not personally aware that triclosan is considered an endocrine disruptor.
Do those have any impact on on algae in water? Are you aware of that?
I couldn't
outside your area of expertise?
Yes.
All right. Is it generally accepted that a longer exposure to contaminants is more likely to affect fish health?
As a general rule, the effects are related to dose, and a longer exposure would give you a higher dose. In some cases where there's a sensitive life stage that it's that exposure at that life stage that's important, not a lifetime exposure. So it would not be true in those cases.
This document on the screen is from 2007. It identifies emerging contaminants as being likely present. What research has been conducted to determine the degree of contamination in those particular areas? Do you know?
The geographical areas?
Those particular lakes identified.
No, I have no knowledge of them.
Turning to tab 26, this is Exhibit 826, the Commission Technical Report. Number 2, potential effects of contaminants on Fraser River sockeye salmon. Don't necessarily need to go into too much depth here. At page 94, though, this report notes that there are limitations on available data, and it goes on to explain that Harrison River stock, I'll quote here, which spends the least time rearing in freshwater habitats, has exhibited increasing productivity over the same period. Such observations suggest that one or more factors associated with freshwater systems could be contributing to the decline of Fraser River sockeye salmon. Now, based on that, would you agree that given this increased productivity of the Harrison, that there is in fact a strong possibility or probability that exposure to contaminants of concern, these emerging contaminants that were identified in that last document, have in fact contributed to the decline of sockeye salmon over the last 20 years?
I would not agree that. I would consider it strongly probable. There are a number of other factors that influence populations, and they act in a cumulative fashion, and I just don't have any knowledge that would lead me to conclude it be probable. Possible, I would say possible, because I have no knowledge to rule it out, but I also have no knowledge to consider it probable.
I believe this report actually uses the term, Mr. Lund, page 7. It says there's a strong possibility that exposure to contaminants of concern and those others. So a strong possibility, would that be a fair characterization then? Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I wouldn't. No, not unless I knew the contaminant you're talking about and I had some indication that there was a mechanism by which it could act in that way. I would not consider it a strong possibility.
In 5 minutes of time, I don't think that I'd be able to take you through that, so thank you for those questions, those answers.
I'm not familiar with the document in any case, sir.
Absolutely, understood. Just one last question then. Isn't it hard to assess likelihood or unlikelihood of impacts when it turns out there's been what seems to be relatively little directed studies on some of these issues? There are often identified knowledge gaps and limited data. Is it not too early to be making these types of decisions or the calls?
In terms of probabilities, etc., there is a growing body of research. I can inform you that in Burlington, DFO and Environment Canada have invested $2.6 million in a new aquatic life research facility that will permit research into full life cycle research into fish and other aquatic organisms, and with species like fathead minnows as our model species, and this will allow us to investigate sensitive life stages of compounds like this. That would give us information that the mechanisms exist for them to act, and then one might be able to make some generalizations with respect to whether they would act on other species such as sockeye. At this point we can't, as far as I know.
Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
The next questioner is Judah Harrison for the Conservation Coalition, and I've asked him if he can keep his questions to 15 to 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner and panel. As Ms. Baker just told you, my name is Judah Harrison, and I represent the Conservation Coalition, which is a group of 6 non-governmental organizations and 1 individual. I'll start with you, Monsieur Paradis. This morning you were talking about ESSRF funding and the elimination of funding for toxic research. And yet after that, after this funding expired, we heard this story of Peter Ross and this PBDE and the passing of science from DFO to Environment Canada, which in my client's view had a very good outcome, which led to 1 PBDE of 3 being banned. So my question for you, my first question is, you claimed this morning that passing off this information to Environment Canada was a fairly difficult process. Is that correct?
Well, I think because it had not been done on a regular basis, we kind of had to pave the way to do it. So that's why I say it was like, a bit of a difficult process because, the scientists suggested we do it, and then we went back and said, well, prepare the CSAS review, and then when it was done, it was transferred. But, it's, originally, I think the scientists thought it would go straight to Environment Canada, and within DFO, we have set up the CSAS process to ensure, a series of criteria of, to protect the interests of all parties.
Can you explain, and I guess you talked about this morning in depth, but post ESSRF lapse, post the lapse of that funding, this project was still funded. Is that, or this science was still funded? Is that correct?
Well, some of it was still funded.
And some of it was...
Okay, I guess in reality is, although we transferred the way the scientists would access the funding, the majority of our scientists are still doing toxic chemical research and are still very well recognized for the work they do. So, like, for example, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Ross, Catherine Couillard in Quebec region, Katsaya, most of our toxic chemical scientists are still in place, apart from those who've retired. It's just the sources of funding have changed. And then, in the case of Dr. Ross, it did find something worth, interest, moved it up the system, and we found a way to address the issue. So I would say the system is not broken in the sense that things cannot happen, but, they could be made simpler. That's what my statement would be.
Thank you. And this is a question I wanted to ask each of you. Can you briefly explain how the precautionary principle guides your work and actions, specifically with respect to contaminants? I'll start with you, Monsieur Paradis.
Well, basically, there is a policy in the federal government that says that, decisions cannot be held back due to the fact there is no scientific evidence to support them. So the precautionary approach to say decisions still have to be made to protect people and limit, irreversible harm. Okay, all those scientific evidence may not all be on the table.
So would you say that the precautionary principle guides your current work with respect to contaminants?
Well, it has to be. It's part of the federal policies that we have to do it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. King.
Yes, I'll respond to that as well. But I'll respond by first saying that precautionary principle is one of those terms like sustainable development that means a lot of things to a lot of people.
I agree.
And the principle, as I understand it, that came out of UNCED and was incorporated into CEPA, et cetera, deals with a situation where there's evidence of harm and there's cost-effective measures that can be put in place to address them. And the principle is that governments will adopt a precautionary approach in that case and not use lack of full scientific certainty as the excuse for doing nothing. That's the principle. That's been incorporated into CEPA, and the way we actually, I was a science person, not a risk assessor and risk manager, which is where the precautionary approach has been incorporated. If you look at the decisions that are made under CEPA on individual chemicals, you will see that there are some decisions with respect to Section 64, with respect to whether we're going to put it on the schedule of toxic substances. Toxic is another word which has a specific legal definition under CEPA, as I'm sure you know. And once it's put on that list, then we get to a risk management phase where we discuss, basically putting on the list means that we feel it's a substance whose risk should be considered for management, not that it's going to kill things. And then in the risk management phase, we discuss things like its distribution, exposures, etc. This is quite different from other jurisdictions. It's quite different from what's done in the United States, where exposures, distribution is part of the risk assessment phase. And it isn't until you've concluded that a risk needs to be managed, and specifically what it is, that it goes to risk management. In Canada, we do a preliminary assessment where the precautionary principle is applied, and many of the considerations that other people do in the risk assessment phase, we do in the risk management phase. So I would say and the consequence of that, frankly, is that we put many things onto the list, the schedule, the list of toxic substances, for which the scientific evidence if we were doing a classic risk assessment of the type they do in other jurisdictions, the scientific evidence isn't there. But we do it in advance of the scientific evidence being there so that we can actually consider a risk management approach to it. And I would say that's a clear example of how Canada actually employs the precautionary principle in moving things forward to risk management, even though the scientific evidence isn't there. And that gives rise to a number of challenges when industry who perceive that they're going to be regulated worry that just by putting it on that list, road salt is a classic example. We put it on the list even though we knew the risk could be managed, but when we put it on the list, people thought we were going to ban it. And so that creates the application of this creates some specific problems for us. The second avenue I would say that Canada has done in advance of many, many other jurisdictions is we created a second track in our risk assessment process, which has to do with persistent bioaccumulating toxic substances. The philosophy there was we've seen enough of them already with respect to PCBs, DDT, etc. We know we don't want them in the environment. So we will not require complete risk assessment, risk management activities. We will put them on a track 1 list, as it's called, which means our policy goal is virtual elimination of releases to the environment without doing complete risk assessments. And we're now in the process, Environment Canada since '99 and amendments, is attempting to screen something like 25,000 chemicals on the domestic substance list for those properties to determine which one should go to track 1 without the multi-year risk assessment, risk management phases. So I would say those are 2 examples by which the precautionary approach is applied in Canada in our regulatory decisions on toxic substances.
Thank you very much for that. If it's okay, I'll move on, Ms. Walsh. Thank you. Can you bring up Exhibit 997, please, Mr. Lund? This is again for you, Dr. Carey. This morning you were talking about this study. And as you can see, the study is titled Presence and Levels of Priority Pesticides in Selected Canadian Aquatic Ecosystems. Focusing on the word selected, my question for you is, does this document or report include any assessment of chemicals in the marine environment?
It was not meant to, no.
And in your view, do contaminants and contaminant exposure in the marine environment, is that part of Environment Canada's responsibility and mandate?
I do not think it is, no.
Thank you. Mr. Paradis, the same question for you. In your opinion or in your view, is marine contamination and exposure to contamination within DFO's mandate?
Well, you know, all along the department has claimed that Section 36 had been transferred and that SEPA should be providing the support to do it. That was the internal, position the department's been taking.
Could I just clarify my answer? I guess
yes.
I'm a scientist, and I ran a science program, and I sometimes forget that you're asking questions about the department as a whole. With respect to your question and our scientific research programs and monitoring programs, I do not believe it's Environment Canada's business to conduct research on the effects of pesticides, occurrence of pesticides in the marine environment, except if there's a Section 36 enforcement action of some type, and we are requested to support that activity internally by our enforcement group, in which case we would support them. It would not be our decision to do it. It would be an enforcement decision under our responsibilities with respect to Section 36. And that's the circumstance under which we might do it.
Going back to your answer, Monsieur Paradis, I would just, I guess, request some additional clarification. I understand that there has been, the Memorandum of Understanding and the transfer of 36.3 to Environment Canada, but I guess from what I heard from Dr. Carey, they do not believe that marine contamination, except as it comes in with 36.3, applies to them. I would just ask you to again answer that question. Do you believe that marine contamination and monitoring of marine contamination falls within DFO's mandate? And this is going back to the concern that Dr. Carey raised, this is in your own opinion.
Well, in my own opinion, it could, but you know what? Clearly, the department was, like, you know, assuming it wasn't something we would do. And in fact, after the decision was made that, you know, the ESSRF was rolled up and we would like back out, there hasn't been any request from DFO for funding on toxic chemical activities to the government. So it was assumed it was a responsibility of Environment Canada. The only program for which toxics or chemical substances has been requested is the Contaminated Site Program, for which the first year of the program, the science sector didn't get any money. So I guess what I interpret out of all of this is that, you know what, the feeling was that, like, the responsibility was Environment Canada. That was the perspective within DFO.
Back to you, Dr. Carey. These are about science, so now I'm out of my depth. So excuse me if the questions are a bit off, but you mentioned that there was a focus, an intended and explicit focus by Environment Canada to focus on biological effects and do science related to biological effects of contaminants, as opposed to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess as opposed to the impact of contaminants on the environment at large or the ecosystem at large? Or as opposed to what?
I'm not sure that I did say that, but I'll try and address it.
Well, if I'm wrong, then please do not.
I'll just, perhaps I don't want to take up your time, just give you a little bit of background. In the early 70s, there was one department, Department of Fisheries and the Environment, and a number of biologists worked in that department. When Department of Fisheries and Oceans was formed in 1978, with the intention that, if you remember, there was a 200-mile limit established and fisheries to be managed by DFO. They actually took nearly all of the biologists with them out of the department, and the philosophy then, the operating principle then, was much of the biology with respect to ecosystem work would be done by DFO, both in freshwater and in marine systems. Approximately, as SEPA came into place and more responsibility was placed on Environment Canada to consider biological effects, Environment Canada did what they could to increase their expertise in that area, culminating in 1995 when we actually brought some fish people from DFO to Environment Canada. And we have been increasing our capacity with respect to biological effects. If that's what you're referring to, I agree with that. But we have been focusing, as I mentioned earlier, on individual organisms, not on populations. With respect to populations, we left that to DFO, in our opinion.
Thank you for that last comment, because then it shows that I was not completely off base, but science that focuses on individuals as opposed to populations. My question to you is, does focusing science on one as opposed to the other, does it, in your view, do more or less for assessing the cumulative impacts of contaminants over and above the other one? That's the first question. The second question would be, does it do better or worse with respect to doing an ecosystem impact assessment, or taking an ecosystem approach? If you can.
Well, I would say there's two separate things then. When I was referring to effects on individuals, I was referring to science supporting regulatory decisions and the level at which those are made within Environment Canada's mandate. Within our research program, I mentioned we had three broad areas of research this morning with individual issue-based projects underneath them. One of those three broad areas is in ecosystem impacts research. And we have and maintain active research programs on how to actually assess ecosystem impacts, precisely because of what you mentioned, precisely because we cannot measure every mixture everywhere under the regulatory program, and ecosystems are subject to stresses from all over. And a rational approach would be to focus our regulatory actions on specific chemicals and effects on specific individuals, but to maintain the capacity to work in ecosystems to determine if things seem to be happening that are unexplained, to go back and try to understand why they're happening. So we do have a significant science program on freshwater ecosystems, partially culminating by the cabin program that I mentioned this morning, how we could go to sites such as sites on the Fraser, use the benthic invertebrates that live there to tell us if they look like they've been impacted in general or not by whatever stressor or whatever combination of stressors. Is that responsive?
Yeah, that's very responsive. Paradis, do you have anything to add to that in your expertise?
No, not really,
Okay,
thanks.
thank you. Ms. Walls, you've been quiet for my questions. I have not asked you one, so I will ask you one. I've noticed from your CV that you currently work at the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you just explain the role of CEA, or the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, in all of this? I mean, explain, please, the role of CEA in ensuring the Fraser River has less contamination in it, if you can, please.
Okay, so the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act ensures that projects for which the federal government has a decision-making responsibility are fully assessed as to their likely environmental effects before decisions are made that can enable those projects to proceed. And there's there's 3 different levels or types of environmental assessment that can be undertaken: a screening, comprehensive study, or panel. But any project that is proposed development project within the Fraser Basin for which there is a federal decision-making responsibility that would be required for it to proceed would be subject to one of those 3 types of environmental assessment. Does
Okay,
that
thank you.
answer your question?
Well, it's very general.
It's very general. I mean,
question, so
it's
okay,
the
thank you.
precautionary principle is one of the guiding principles, and it's also an act to support sustainable development. So
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Yesterday, Ms. Walls, again, you referenced streamlining, and then you spoke specifically about the reduced capacity for enforcement. This is when you were at DFO, I guess, and reduced capacity. No? Sorry.
This was when I was at Environment Canada
Sorry,
until
thank you.
2009, and I spoke about reduced capacity for compliance promotion and compliance verification.
I wanted to ask you about
pursuant to related to the Section 36(3), which is the general prohibition against pollution provisions of the Fisheries Act.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you what the word compliance, or the term compliance promotion, means.
Well, it's defined quite well in the Fisheries Act compliance promotion policy document, but it refers to a number of different activities that are undertaken to ensure the regulated community fully understands their obligations to comply with, in this case, the pollution prevention provisions of the Fisheries Act, and the development of guidance material, best practices, and ensuring that the regulated whoever the best practices are directed at fully understands what they need to do to ensure that they do not deposit a deleterious substance into waters frequented by fish. So it's efforts to stop the pollution at the source.
And is this where the suite of tools that DFO or Environment Canada have available to them is discussed? A reference?
Well, we talk about a compliance continuum that ranges from compliance promotion, as I just described, right through to inspections or investigations and enforcement activity if there is a suspected violation. We also refer to a toolbox, and a regulatory or toolbox can include, all different types of regulatory instruments that can be used to ensure that pollution is avoided.
Okay, thank you. And my question then is, has there been any assessment by either Environment Canada or DFO about the effectiveness of each of these suite of tools? I mean, we hear there's various options, and we hear that whether maybe not directly, but certainly indirectly, that investigations or is the last option. So has Environment Canada, in your knowledge, done any assessment of the usefulness or effectiveness of each of these tools?
Well, that is the exact purpose of the environmental effects monitoring programs that are in place with respect to the pulp and paper effluent regulations and the metal mining effluent regulations. Those programs are designed to assess whether or not the regulatory limits are adequately protective of the aquatic environment. Other regulatory instruments in terms of the effectiveness. There are specific studies that are undertaken. For instance, in the agriculture sector, there was a lot of work done under the Fraser River Action Plan where we, looked at development of best practices, and then there were receiving environment studies that were done to determine whether or not there were impacts, what the level of impact on the receiving environment using tools such as Cabin. But those will be more specific studies. The formal evaluation that I'm aware of would be the EM programs.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Walls. This is my final question. Back to you, Dr. Carey. I forgot to ask you this question. With respect to Exhibit 997 and that report, you discussed trying to get information on use of pesticides from PMRA, and you then said that was more difficult than you thought it would be. Is that correct?
Yeah, please let me clarify that. PMRA were a partner in the original project, and their role was going to be to try and provide use on pesticides, and it provided more difficult for them to participate in that way. We had to go back and rely on sales information, which, as I mentioned this morning, was faulty. So it wasn't difficult to get information from PMRA. It was difficult for PMRA to get information to participate in the project as originally hoped.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Next questioner is Crystal Reeves for the First Nations Coalition.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. For the record, Crystal Reeves, First Nations Coalition. For the benefit of the witnesses, that includes the Haida Nation, the First Nations Fisheries Council, tribes up and down the Fraser River to Prince George, as well as some Douglas Treaty Nations. Mr. Lund, could you please pull out Exhibit 993, please? Dr. Carey, this morning you went through with the Commission the Canada-BC Water Quality Monitoring Agreement that's in place. Is that correct?
We referred to it, yes.
Yes, and I'd like to go to page 6 of that document, if you could. And just on the second bullet there, down from the top. Thank you. So on page 6, it talks about 39 stations in British Columbia measuring water quality, and I think you confirmed this morning that 6 of those are on the Fraser River. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, because I learned afterwards that since my retirement, additional stations have been added, and particularly with respect to the water quality indicator funded through that program. So I have now learned that, although I don't know where all of them are, there is between 8 and 12 stations on the Fraser system. And
then if you look at the bullet point there, it says the Canada-BC hydrometric agreement currently operates about 475 flow stations in the province. And I was just wondering if you know anything about that.
I'm familiar with the program, yes. It's one of the programs was not under my direction, but I'm familiar with it.
Okay, thank you. So I guess my question is, would you agree that if we're concerned about water quality, that perhaps we should be putting resources into upping the amount of water quality monitoring stations, particularly on the Fraser River, and to the same extent perhaps that we have stations for flow?
I think we could use more stations. I think we need to be a little bit careful comparing these two networks. A flow measurement is a simple physical measurement. It's relatively inexpensive to do. These days we can do it in real time and report via telephone or satellite. A water quality program is a values-based program. It can measure literally hundreds of parameters if you've got the budget. And frankly, we don't have the budgets for that. And Part of the problem with the water quality program, in my experience, has been, at least in the past, we get many, many measurements that come back non-detect. In other words, we've looked for something that's below our detection limit or not there. And as you get into environments where people are looking for programs that are ineffective, if 75% of the data in your database is non-detect, auditors look at that and think they're paying a lot of millions of dollars for zeros, and it's ineffective. That's one of the reasons why we've attempted to devise a system for the biological assessment of water quality, which is more cumulative and more informative with respect to general conditions in water quality, and keep as part of our arsenal these surveillance studies to go on and look in more detail on a less regular frequency. That's been the philosophy, to rather than establish more routine monitoring stations that will give us more non-detects, that will be harder to justify, to adopt a different philosophy where we look for problems and then go and try and identify them using biological and then chemical measurements.
Of the, I guess, 8 to 10 now water quality stations, are you aware of whether they're actually measuring new emerging contaminants at these stations?
No, I'm not aware of that. New emerging contaminants, you mean pharmaceuticals and siloxane, personal care products, things like that, or?
It could include that. We've also heard previously at the commission about PPDEs as well as other...
Diphenyl ethers, yes.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know the degree to which they're employed in the biweekly sampling. I would suspect, however, that they would be more likely the target of surveillance studies if they're measured than in the routine core parameters.
And also, would you agree that it would be useful to have some water quality monitoring stations in the marine environment?
Useful for the Government of Canada? For the people
Well,
of Canada?
useful, I think, for managing and the long-term sustainability of Fraser River Sockeye.
Yes, I agree it would be useful to have those stations.
To flip over in the same document to page 12 and 13, Mr. Lunn. So on page 12 and 13, this is a list of principal partners, contributors, clients, and customers of I guess, this agreement and the business plan. And I didn't see any First Nations put on this list. And I was wondering if you could confirm that.
No, I can't confirm that. I'm sorry, I just don't have the report memorized to that extent.
Okay, well, I can tell you that it doesn't say that. And so I guess my question is, does Environment Canada view First Nations as a partner in water quality monitoring in the province?
I think they would view First Nations more, I'm not sure they do view them as a partner. No, I couldn't say that. I think they would view them more as a user of the information, so more like a client or a customer.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd like to point out that the data generated by this program has been made publicly available by Environment Canada, so it is available to First Nations and others.
Right, but they're not identified as a partner, customer, or client on the list within the document.
It's probably an omission.
Thank you. And I guess what is specifically being done, I guess, by Environment Canada or DFO for that matter to include First Nations as a partner in water quality monitoring work that you're aware of?
Well, as we don't have like water quality monitoring and science program in DFO, maybe the habitat management people could respond to this because it would have been managed out of the region, and sitting in Ottawa, I wasn't part of those direct interaction with the community people, but DFO has a number of agreements with First Nations, so I would assume there might be something, maybe not on water quality, but on other issues.
And anything at Environment Canada?
Only in a very general way. I can't specifically comment because I'm not aware of what activities may or may not happen. I'm not aware of any. I'll make that clear.
Okay.
But I will point out that, as I mentioned this morning, this switch to the cabin monitoring program, one of the commitments Canada and BC have made is to keep the reference database up to date so that anyone, a First Nation or a pulp company, who wish to assess water quality using the cabin system would only have to do their particular site in the area they were interested in, and not develop their own database, et cetera, to apply the program. So they would be supported in that way if they chose to do it.
My next set of questions are for Ms. Wells to start, and then if others want to add. This morning and yesterday, we heard, I guess, about the lack of formal communication between DFO and Environment Canada on contaminants and on Section 36 Fisheries Act matters. Would you agree with that? About the lack of formal communication, that there's a lack of formal communication?
Well, in the regional office where I worked, we lost a good coordination mechanism, which was through the water quality unit at DFO. And once that wound down, we kind of reformulated our pathways of communication on a program-specific basis for select programs that I've previously articulated, such as environmental emergencies and contaminated sites. But with respect to coordinating and priority setting on the compliance promotion for Section 36.3 general prohibition, pollution prevention provisions, we didn't have a formal mechanism in place.
Okay. And are you familiar with the CESD report that was done in 2009?
Yes.
That was a review?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm familiar with it because it's come out as part of the list of documents for this hearing process, and I've read it.
Okay.
It was actually submitted just after I left Environment Canada, but it's a public document.
Okay. If we could have Exhibit 35, Mr. Lennon. And if you can go to page 44.
On paper or within the community?
Sorry, on paper, but maybe first of all I should get her to confirm that this is actually the report. It's chapter 1 of the CESD report. Does that look familiar to you, Ms.
Yes.
Wells? Okay, if we could go to page 44, it's number 38 in Ringtail.
Okay.
And if you could go to 1.133. And as part of the review, what it says there is there were no formal arrangements by which Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Environment Canada established the expectations for administration of the pollution prevention provisions of the Fishery Act. Environment Canada's administration of the provisions have been left to its discretion. Would you agree that that's a correct characterization?
Well, there was the formal arrangement that was put in place was the 1985 MOU. However, from the time of 2004 until when I left, I would say that it was not operationalized in terms of any formal arrangement or a management structure or leadership for how the department would fulfill its responsibilities for the Section 36.3 of the Fisheries Act in particular on the compliance promotion side of things.
And the top paragraph here has Environment Canada's and Fisheries and Oceans Canada's response, and both appeared to accept the recommendation and suggested that they would review by March 31st, 2011, the administration of Section 37 of the Fisheries Act and a renewed memorandum of understanding of the, 1985 MOU to better establish expectations and responsibilities for Environment Canada. Do you know if this review is being completed?
No, because this, I don't know if it's been completed, but I understand that, the department has accepted this recommendation and is proceeding with that along those lines. This recommendation was tabled after I left the department. I would certainly agree with this recommendation, and I think it would go a long way to addressing some of the issues that we've heard about in this panel.
Okay, and Dr. Paradis, are you aware of where things are at with the renewal, of the MOU?
No, I don't know. And, the management is with the Habitat Protection Management Program, so Science would not be the one to renew the agreement.
I guess a question I would have is for you, Ms. Wells, is you agree with the renewal of the MOU, and do you think this could be a place where a way to engage, I guess, First Nations and how they might be involved in some of the work going forward with Environment Canada and DFO on Section 36 Fisheries Act issues?
Yeah, I mean, this is an MOU between two departments with respect to how they administer a piece of federal legislation. So, you know, a question about how First Nations would be involved in that would be something that I don't know the answer to that. You should ask the people that are working on the renewal of the MOU.
Right, okay, thank you. Moving on to you, Dr. Paradis, we've heard a lot about the loss of the toxic chemical program. And I guess my first question is, was consideration given in Ottawa to how the lack of a specific research program on toxic chemicals might impact upon our ability to understand the effects of contaminants on Fraser River and Fraser River sockeye?
I would say, like, by moving to the ecosystem perspective, all of those dimensions are important to be considered. And, you know, like, there were, like, concerns about the fact that some research was not taking place. But basically, the idea was that it would be moved to the regions to make those decisions based on needs and requirements, because they're quite varied across the country.
I guess then if it's moved to the region, are you aware of studies being done on Fraser River sockeye and the Fraser River with respect to contaminants then, since the move to, I guess, a more ecosystem-based management and the funding going towards that?
No.
Okay. I guess my other question is, when reductions like this are being made or, I guess, imposed in Ottawa, how are the risks assessed, whether you keep it as a separate program or whether you move it to sort of a more regional based, and who provides you with an assessment of what the risks might be to a species such as Fraser River sockeye?
Usually the regions are assessing, you know, what the risks and the needs are for their own regions. And, you know, like, I would say priority setting is a constant issue. We keep doing it all the time based on new information and shifts. So, like, you know, I think there's always this balance where Ottawa was keeping the competitive funds, and, you know, the regions would actually do the assessment and apply for funds from Ottawa to actually deliver, except for those programs which were regionally based. Like, you know, some programs, like, for example, the Pacific Salmon Program is all based in Pacific region. So it was expected that if something about toxics would be identified, this program could actually look into it, or, you know, like, with a mix of different programs, try to tackle the issue.
Right, but you're unaware of any scientist applying for funds to do that?
Why? Because, you know, the national fund was actually disbanded. You know, there was still A-based funding in the region, so there might have been studies in the region that I wasn't aware of.
Earlier today, you also said that when the decision was being implemented and the ESS RF cuts were being made or rolled out, you didn't know that the water quality unit was also being cut. Is that correct?
Yep, that's true.
And it was also during this period, I guess, in 2004, 2005, that the wild salmon policy was being finalized as well?
I would assume so.
Right, and so did these factor into your decision when to implement, I guess, the cuts to the toxic research program?
Well, every region came in and, you know, assessed what the impacts would be. Like, you know, it's, I think, you know, the transformation of the funding envelope was not done on a case-by-case basis, was done at more of a general program assessment.
But did anybody specifically provide you with an assessment of how devolvement of the funds might impact Fraser River sockeye specifically, particularly if the water quality unit was being dismantled and at the same time as we have the wild salmon policy being finalized?
Well, I don't think those things were connected. Like, I don't think it came into a global assessment, certainly not at my level. And you know, in fact, about the water quality unit, I only found it out through the commission. because, you know, I didn't know Habitat had this office or this unit. So, you know, in fact, at first, I thought people were talking about the transformation we were doing to our research lab in Victoria. And then, you know, it said DGs of exchange correspondence. So I said, well, I haven't exchanged correspondence with anybody. And when I discovered it was Mr. McGilvery, I realized there was another component that I had not been informed of.
Moving on, I think this may be directed to the entirety of the panel if you wish to speak on it. I guess it's important to our clients to understand how Environment Canada, DFO, and include as well as First Nations can work together on Fraser River Sockeye matters going forward. And I guess given what we've heard in the last 2 days about working together and some of the challenges that with DFO and Environment Canada, would you agree that Environment and DFO should have a specific research team working directly on the long-term sustainability and monitoring of Fraser River Sockeye? And this would include data management programs and as well as working on the implementation of the wild salmon policy. Would you agree that such a research team would be useful?
Short answer is yes, I would.
There is a current initiative that is potentially relevant to this, which is the Salish Sea initiative, which is a joint program between or gathering of Environment Canada, DFO, and the First Nations the Coast Salish First Nations, and they do meet on an annual basis and talk about joint areas of interest and priorities. So there is some dialogue going on through that forum. It's not necessarily the groups that you're representing, but it's certainly an opportunity to have that input and discussion.
Right, and would you agree that perhaps a similar thing should happen perhaps for the Fraser River then? Of something similar to what you just described?
Yeah, I think it would be useful in terms of, you know, a shared dialogue on issues of common concern and interest.
Yeah.
That's not the same as a research program.
If I might add, I think, you know, such approach, like research program would be desirable, but I think people should look at best practice. There are programs that have actually demonstrated extremely good results, and I'd like to mention the Northern Contaminant Program, where there was a joint table where, you know, the Aboriginal people, the government would come together, set priorities, and work together at integrating the information. So, for example, like, you know, DFO may have done, like, you know, toxic chemical in fish. Health Canada was there for human exposure. Environment was there for other issues. There was an open dialogue on research issues, and priorities were done collectively. So I think there are best practice. You know, another one could be the International Polar Year, where, you know, academia and all the partners came together, set up priorities, and worked together. So I think, you know, there would be huge benefits to look at what actually has allowed First Nation communities and Inuit communities to be a real partner in their research efforts.
Right, and then perhaps this could be done on the Fraser River.
Could be done, yeah.
There's one other group, the Fraser Basin Council, that was certainly in existence when I left Environment Canada, which First Nations are a full partnership in, and it's an opportunity to have that discussion and dialogue. And I think, you know, I would defer to those groups to decide what their priorities would be to work together, whether it be toxic research or other types of initiatives.
Right, and I guess I'm just wondering if that would work together though with Environment Canada and DFO, and to try and sort of better coordinate their working relationship within that basis as well.
I'd just like to, you know, I responded positively, and perhaps a one-word answer is not appropriate here. I think that what you described is precisely what I tried to indicate we are moving towards, which is our monitoring programs trying to detect problems rather than trying to provide information for everybody everywhere, and us using the programs to identify priorities that we can then develop action plans for. So I'm not talking about establishing some sort of general sort of infrastructure. I was really supporting, we appear to have a problem here. This is a significant enough problem to bring people together to develop a science action plan to address it. And that's what I was supporting. I think it's a rational way in this environment that we're in now, and I heard the finance minister announce we're in for yet another set of cuts. And the environment we've been in since 1995 of cutting, we need a rational way to set priorities and to bring people together to get the most we can for the resources we've got. And I believe what you're proposing is a way to do that.
I just have a couple final questions. We've already heard in this commission about en route mortality issues. This is dying without being caught, if you're unfamiliar with that term. Pre-spawn mortality, issues of climate change, sea lice, all of those things affecting the Fraser River sockeye. And it's clear that we may need to do research, obviously, on contaminants and genetics. We heard from Dr. McDonald yesterday that he would definitely support a dual research program such as that. And I guess our question is, who would be the best if such a program was going to go ahead that was going to look at contaminants, look at genetics, perhaps look at climate change? Which of DFO or Environment Canada would best be able to do this work going forward? Or should it be a collaboration between you?
Well, I think the best success that I've seen is a department gets the lead, but it is recognized that the funding envelope is a shared envelope. You know, I think the problem is when the money falls in one place, you know, sometimes it's hard for people to access the funds. You know, when I spoke about the North Contaminant Program, one of its beauty was that, you know, there was this joint fund. And, you know, although it was like Indian Affairs that was managing the program, every other departments were actually working with them in collaboration. So I think, you know, I'm not sure if it cares if it's DFO or Environment Canada, as long as the lead is clear and access to collective funds. And you know what? They were just positioned for Aboriginal to access federal funds to do activities in the north. I think that's just, if the rules of the games are clear, I think, you know, it should work.
Okay.
I think I'm clearly in favor of collaboration, but I would think, and you mentioned a bunch of environmental factors. There's other factors too, and frankly, there's fishing pressures, etc. I think to address the population level impacts, the lead would have to be with the department that had responsibility for the population, which would be DFO, but Environment Canada would have to be strongly supportive of that and collaborate with that. So there would need to be joint work plans, etc. But I really believe the lead would be DFO.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if we could just cover off any re-examination points and then we can let these witnesses go. Canada, do you have any re-exam?
I do have one question on re-examination. These are a question for Dr. Paradis and Dr. Carey. Just to follow up on a question that Mr. Harrison asked you about the respective mandates of your department with respect to toxic chemicals research. I'd like to go to tab 14 of Canada's documents. I believe that's Exhibit 980. That'd be page 14 of Ringtail. So this is the Strategic Review of Toxic Chemicals Research document, and Dr. Paradis, you indicated you're familiar with it. I just want to go to the heading that says federal departments or agencies with responsibilities for toxic chemicals. I just want to clarify something, and it says under the heading, subheading Mandates, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I just want to read the first couple of lines. DFO's mandate states that DFO is responsible for policies and programs in support of Canada's economic, ecologic, and scientific interests in oceans and inland waters, and for the conservation and sustainable utilization of Canada's fisheries resources in marine and inland waters. Policies and programs undertaken to implement this program must be based on an understanding of how marine and freshwater ecosystems function and how they are affected. So this refers to both marine and inland waters. Has this mandate changed since 2003?
No.
Thank you. Maybe we can go to the next page. This would be for Dr. Carey. And under the heading Environment Canada, and I won't read the whole thing, I'll just read the first sentence and the last sentence. Environment Canada conducts research to protect aquatic ecosystems from the impacts of toxic chemicals by developing knowledge and understanding of priority pollutants to support informed environmental decision-making and sustainable management practices. And in the last sentence, the primary focus of such research is in the freshwater ecosystems. Recognizing this is a DFO document, Dr. Carey, do you agree with basically how that's written?
I do.
Those are my questions.
Thank you, and I have one re-examination question. Dr. Paradis, when Mr. Harrison was asking you some questions, you stated that when talking about the change in science funding, you stated that in reality we transferred the funding over, and our scientists are still doing toxic work. It's just the sources of funding that have changed. And I just wanted to confirm, though, that prior to the changes in 2004, 2005, 42% of the toxic chemical work being done by science and DFO was with respect to fate and transport research, and that is no longer being done by DFO science. Is that fair?
Well, there's still work done on fate and transport, but the source of funding are not the traditional ones. They may come from environment or Indian Affairs or other programs.
Certainly in the Pacific region, the work from people like Robbie McDonald, as we heard yesterday, is no longer being funded. Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, those are all the questions I have for these witnesses.
Mr. Lunn, could you just bring back up Exhibit 980 and the 2 pages that Mr. East just referred to? It was page 14. I'm not sure if the other one was page 15 or not. Perhaps more to Mr. Paradis, because he addressed this a little bit earlier. But the 2 descriptions there of the mandates, I think the panel were in agreement that those are the mandates for the DFO and the Environment Canada. And to the extent that within those mandates, programs are adopted by either DFO or Environment Canada, or there's some collaboration around a program which requires funding, and a funding source is established, and then later on changes are made to the funding envelope or to the requirements or to the distribution, whatever. I was trying to understand at that same time, there are in the regions implications that flow with respect to adopting certain national policies, but they are adjusted for regional requirements and so on. And I was trying to understand whether you were suggesting that when it comes time for you at the federal level or the national level to sit around the table and decide upon continuation of a program or adjustment of a policy and a program or a practice, whether there's a disconnect between that consideration and all of the activity that's taking place at the regional level. In other words, changes are being made at the national level and the implications are there for the regional programs, but there's no connection at that level with regard to the implications. So is it sort of, we make the decision and then we let you know about it and you just have to make do, or you have to adjust accordingly, or you have to come to us later and tell us how the implications are? Just give me a general sort of picture of how that works.
Well, the policy decision were made by the National Science Directors Committee and were actually passed along to the Departmental Management Committee. So, and on both those bodies, there is regional representation. So the regions have had a chance to express their views.
Before
before everything got rolled out. So, you know, like, it's not like Ottawa decides and throws it out. In fact, the reality is DFO is an extremely decentralized program. And, you know, like, so the regions have quite a bit of capacity. And the reality is, in the case of Pacific region, they had a specific MOU with Environment Canada that almost no other regions had. So I would say, I would certainly disagree with the fact that we make decision in Ottawa and we threw it out. Like, you know what, we consulted. It's those things are not easy to manage. You know, they have a lot of repercussions. And, you know, so I think the region brought their views to the table. And then there were other views about the fact that, you know what, I think in this case, the mandate is the one of the department. I think the little trigger that would really need to be fixed is, what does the delegation of Section 36 means for real? You know, I think, you know, there's a bit of a confusion. You know, some people have interpreted this delegation as the fact that Environment Canada was to take it over. You know, I was pleased to hear, like Dr. Carey said, it wasn't the interpretation Environment Canada had. And, you know, I think it's been a long-lasting issue to figure out what that really meant. But, you know, like, there's been a lot of papers written and the MOUs tried to fix that issue. So I think clarifying this would certainly help everybody.
Your Honor, if I may, with respect to Environment Canada, not a lot of attention was focused today on our transformation, for which I'm grateful. But generally speaking, the net result of the transformation was more integrated programs at the national level, as opposed to what we had prior to 2005, which was these individual regional programs that may or may not have had some consistency. But we specifically created, and it's very confusing to get into, but we separated the management of programs from the management of people and created groupings of outcome projects, as we call them, that are national in scope but involve regional folks who bring the regional aspects to the table. And so our funding now for water, and quite different from my responsibilities as Director General for the water folks in terms of managing people, I led the outcome project grouping for water, which had people who didn't report to me from the Meteorological Service and from other places, and they received their funding through that single avenue. And so the objective of our transformation, and frankly there was 2 years of maybe more of just outright pain trying to figure out how it was going to work. The objective was to have a more nationally consistent program and have the ability to set priorities, even regional priorities, at the national level, and to redirect work from these national funding sources on a annual review type basis towards some of these issues. So I believe we created a mechanism for these to be raised and to be funded. Unfortunately, we also created it in an atmosphere that we've been in the federal government now for 15 years, where these days, every 3 years, these strategic reviews occur and departments are expected to identify the lower 5% of their programs for governments to consider canceling. And so at the senior management level, sir, it becomes a preoccupation. You're either preparing for a review, you're in the middle of a review, you're implementing a review, or you're getting ready for the next one. That, coupled with the sunset programs, make me wonder if it's actually going to be possible to deliver some of these integrated, targeted programs that would be necessary to manage things like sockeye salmon. I really am concerned about that.
Thank you. Anything that the members of the panel would want to add to Dr. Perry's? Anything arising that council may want to address? Well, thank you very much, members of the panel. I take it from Ms. Baker's invitation to me that this panel is now, I won't say terminated, but at least finished for the day. I want to thank you very much for attending at the Commission, for providing us with your knowledge, and for answering the questions of council. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If we take the break now, we can return with a new panel of people to meet.
Hearing we're now recess for 10 minutes.